Please listen carefully.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Listen Up, the podcast from Harkn with me, David Bellamy, where we are talking about all things voice of the employee and listening to employees. Today, once again, I'm joined by Lydia Blundell, our branding content manager, and we're going to be talking about surveys. Lydia, now you recently wrote a blog and shared it on our website entitled, "Are Your Surveys Still Serving You?" Or your engagement surveys still serving you? So I'm pretty opinionated on this subject, but I really want to get your views because you were looking into it. Firstly, what's overarching impressions of surveys?
Yeah, well, I think if anybody listening hasn't filled out a survey or distributed a survey at some point in their life, then I'd be very surprised because surveys are incredibly ubiquitous, part of organizational life for a lot of people. So I think I just wanted to do a deep dive into how they've been used over the years, how that's evolved, and how well they are helping organizations to deliver on their goals. So I think my overarching sort of top line impression is that surveys are useful. They are no longer the answer to the demands of the modern workplace. Everything has changed so much since they were first introduced. And they were first introduced in the 1920s, by the way, which I found pretty startling because I had no idea that they'd been used for that long, or that organizations were interested in measuring employee engagement back then. But yeah, I mean, awareness of debate around whether or not surveys are delivering on what organizations need from them is definitely increasing. And actually today, Harvard Business Review just published an article about them. It's titled something like 3 Key Metrics That Engagement Surveys Miss. And they pulled out team success, innovation, and trends, which I think we would agree with, but I think they probably missed a trick by not talking about well-being there, because that's probably one of the main shortfalls of surveys. But I'll just quote their conclusion before I go into my own research. It's quite a strongly worded conclusion, but I think it has actually got a lot of truth in it. So they said, old habits truly do die hard. Nevertheless, many habits need to be shelved, including the belief that engagement surveys are the answer to revving up employee engagement. They've had their time to shine and they just aren't working. So that kind of sets the scene.
No, it does. And I think it is quite strongly worded, isn't it? Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think we've been on that campaign for some time, haven't we? And I think, even from when we started, I was quite anti-survey at the beginning. I think I'm still much more nuanced in that position right now in terms of they have a place. But let's go back. Let's go back then. So, of course, people you said they began in the 20s. Engagement wasn't a concept then, for sure. But what were people using it for back then?
So I think kind of post-industrial revolution, we were looking at a very different set of needs and a very different working landscape. So I think organizations realized that their people could just up and leave and go potentially somewhere else if they weren't happy with their work life. So the word that was thrown around a lot then was kind of satisfaction. So, which I always associate immediately with kind of bare minimum. But a remarkable amount of organizations still use the word satisfaction when they're talking about running surveys, which I think is a little bit archaic. But they were fairly straightforward version of what we now know to be surveys, essentially just to measure how likely people were to stay on and kind of the state of the workforce from like a very top level lens. And then as the needs of the workplace have evolved, as society has evolved, they took on this focus on engagement and to some extent themes like well-being. So yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think and I understand the point about whether it's an archaic expression. I'm personally probably a little less bothered by that. I always think we place an awful lot of emphasis on the words because, of course, it's been satisfaction, and then it was engagement for a period, and then now it's all about experience. They're largely measuring the same sorts of things, aren't they? When you looked at surveys, then what were the main benefits? Why have companies? It's a big industry now, right? So why have they become so ubiquitous?
Yeah, I think it's very much worth saying that organizations run surveys because they want to improve things in their business and they want to do right by their people. And it's also worth saying that these are not easy or cheap things to run. I saw a statistic earlier that suggested that in the US, the most sort of basic survey package would cost an organization around $25,000, and they can go up to $250,000. They're very long and convoluted processes behind running them. And I think the reasons that organizations use surveys and have used surveys, when you do some research into it, it's engagement is always mentioned. And we always talk about how engagement is a difficult word because it has so many different connotations and takes on so many different meanings in different places. Organizational culture and employee well-being increasingly. So those are probably the three areas that most survey designs kind of center around. And I think what surveys are good for is much like market research that you might run if you're in like a customer success team or a marketing team. It's real like broad brushstrokes kind of, this is where we're at, and it's easy to say this is where we are today, this is where we are last year, this is where we were 2 years ago. But something in the history piece behind surveys, I think the problem comes from the fact that when surveys were first introduced, commonly held perception of what an organization was and how it worked was very different to how we know them to be now. So when you were looking to tackle things like engagement, organizations were seen as kind of machine-like entities made up of different components. And if you kind of press the right buttons, then you would get the right outcomes. And the way that surveys work feeds into that really well because you design the survey around what you want to find out about, what you think the biggest issues are. You get your answers, you make an action plan, and then wait for everything to be great, which unfortunately doesn't quite work because over time we've come to understand that organizations don't work like that. They're much more dynamic, evolving, ever-changing. And most importantly, they're not machines at all because they're made up of individual people who have all got different perspectives and experiences. So, yeah, I mean, those are sort of the intentions, and I think that they're good intentions. And where surveys are useful is like that broad overview of high-level trends and patterns and how that they evolve over time, but not so much at a more nuanced level.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, I get that. So let's talk on the other side then. So did you, when you were looking into this stuff, when you were, I guess, researching your blog, what are the big things that are the sort of shortcomings?
Yeah, so I think, there's two statistics that ironically come from Gallup, who kind of are very heavily associated with the survey itself, but they did a sort of meta-analysis of surveys, so a survey about surveys. And there's two statistics that really stood out to me that they pulled from this, and I think that they paint the broader picture really well. So one was that 45% of employees think that their survey responses can be traced back to them, which is really interesting from our perspective because we're in the business of anonymous employee listening. an employee voice. It's also worth saying that that's very rarely the case, because external survey providers do ensure anonymity, and that's why they're external. Internally run surveys slightly different, because it's more confidentiality rather than anonymity, the assurance that your responses won't be shared. But I think it speaks volumes that people respond that way, because one, it suggests that if they don't feel safe in giving that feedback, then the feedback is perhaps not as accurate or honest as it could be. But two, it's just exposing like a trust problem that a lot of organizations have, which I think to some extent stems from the survey and the over-reliance on those kind of listening mechanisms. So that's one point that I found really interesting. And the second, which is even more striking, is that 92% of people said that they think that no action will come from their survey response, which is just like an enormous proportion. And again, to defend the organizations running the survey, is that it's highly unlikely that no action has come from the results of surveys. But then it comes down to the cycle that you're stuck in, because you run the survey, it can take, I think you said, because when we first start working with organizations, they're usually using some kind of periodic survey. And one company we were working with, it can take months and months to what's going to be in the survey, then roll it out, get all the questions back in. If you're going to work with a consultant or whatever to unpack them, do all of that. And then the problem is by the time the changes are implemented, very well-intentioned, wanting to make positive change, is people don't recognize that you're answering their feedback, because one, leadership are constrained by the fact that they can only pick out the most dominant trends that came out of the survey. That's just pragmatism. And that means that anybody who expressed a kind of less commonly held view or a different perspective, it's quite unlikely that that feedback would translate into the higher level action plans off the back of the survey. But that kind of perception that nothing will change makes people disengage, which is exactly what the survey sets out to tackle. So that's really interesting. And I think that's probably where everybody's talking about survey fatigue at the moment. And survey fatigue, I think there's loads of dialogue about it. And I think some of it misses the point slightly. And it's should we do less surveys, and should we change the way we do surveys? But I think it's actually that it's in the process that comes from, because people think, I've given feedback, nothing happened, why would I do it again? And that all is down to that sort of slightly clunky process.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of stuff wrapped up in that, isn't there? That cycle, because it's I think that the thing you're describing is a long time to do. Of course, and technology's evolved, and there's lots of new players in the market, aren't there? The pulse survey type stuff that offer do this real time, because it's live as soon as you've answered the survey, kind of thing. But yeah, there's much more to that not feeling or recognizing the change that follows. I mean, I think you raised a really interesting point about the pragmatism. And I often describe that in a slightly different way. Unfortunately, what happens is that unless we're strapped to the squeakiest wheel, so I happen to agree with enough people so that the thing that I've said happens to be one of the dominant themes, then my voice isn't heard at all in them. But I think one of the other downsides, and this is not necessarily the survey thing, but it is all tied up in it, because when you do the broad brush approach, and it's typically Likert scale, and yes, sure, you can add some comments if you want to elaborate. The difficulty is, and we see this all the time, don't we, that I still don't know why people have said what they've said. So what I've got is, I might have 1,000 people who are all believing that this is an area that we could do better in.
Yeah.
That's only one lens, right? It's just where to look. It's not what to do about it. And the difficulty then is the top-down change comes, and I don't. So it could even be that I've answered the question. I am strapped to the squeakiest wheel. The change comes associated with that squeaky wheel, and yet I still don't recognise the change as being beneficial to me, and that's sort of part of the problem, isn't it? And the thing that you were describing, by the way, that sort of creating disengagement as a result of not feeling heard becomes a trust point, doesn't it? I don't feel like I matter.
Yep.
I don't feel anybody listens, and therefore we're constantly sort of breaking opportunities to build trust, if you like, or breaking trust.
Yeah, so, and I think on the trust point, it feels like it always sort of comes back to trust in the end. But I think it's an agency thing as well, because people they want to feel heard and valued, as we well know. But inviting feedback in a kind of one-way method doesn't really contribute to that feeling very well. People want to have the chance, one, to talk about whatever they want to talk about, because obviously surveys are assumption-based, because to create the questions, you're assuming what you think people want to talk about. And actually lived experiences are much more diverse and nuanced than that, and there may be something going on that you just have no idea about. But also just it coming back to the point of perceived inaction, it's because the feedback loop is so drawn out. Whereas if you were to be able to voice that feedback, hear from leadership, hear about the context or whatever, and then respond again, it'd be very different. And I think Wendy, our head of engagement, always uses the analogy of just when you put workplace relationships into a personal context, you quickly realize how strange they feel. So she uses the analogy of, imagine if you just said to your partner, from now on, I'm just going to communicate with you in a series of like memos, like broadcast style memos. So on Saturday, we're going for dinner at my parents'. No response or discussion about it. And then once every 6 months, you say, you can now give feedback on these topics that I've suggested. Like, that just kind of seems insane. Obviously that's an analogy, but I think that's where they start to feel transactional, and that's what makes people feel. I think that's where like the fatigue and the all comes from.
Yeah. The other thing that's going through my mind right now, because I think that's absolutely right. That, of course, revealing that story I tell often is not my own story at Wendy's is not helpful. But thank you. But so the analogy is a really good one. Yeah, no, but I'm always using that one and pretend it's my own. But you're absolutely right. It's Wendy's thought process. But the so what about some of you talked at the beginning about stuff, like big changes in the workplace, and not just that we're seeing them more dynamically. How did you, when you were looking into this stuff, how did you find the whole sort of changing of the world of work and how that's affecting the way surveys are being received and what they mean today?
Yeah, I think change happens far more frequently and at a much faster pace than it ever did before. I think there's some data around employees are experiencing huge amount more and high level change, enterprise level change than they ever did before. We're always introducing new technologies, new processes, and certainly in Harkn, that those are the types of things that we see people talking about all the time. I'm really struggling with the new shift allocation system, or I don't understand how this technology works. Like, those are things that are introduced very regularly, and like rightfully so, because businesses evolve at a much quicker rate. We've got this kind of very competitive like markets and staying ahead of the curve. So that's where to hear from your people kind of very infrequently becomes, you're just not going to get to the heart of what is going on quick enough. But also we've obviously completely changed the way we work in terms of workplaces are much more digital, much more distributed, more flexible. And that presents a number of issues as well. And I think the irony with remote work is that we've actually almost taken a bit of a step back because surveys are now even more dominant in terms of a listening method because we don't have as much face-to-face contact or, old school tactics old school, they should be very present, but management by walking around and all those things that it used to kind of supplement the periodic listening piece and make people feel more connected. And I think, connection and belonging is probably my other shortfall with surveys because the survey process exists in kind of a vacuum. It is likely that you would be told, what the broad stroke results were. I've definitely sat in meetings before and been, seen bits pulled out, data, spreadsheets. But I think, for example, the recent catastrophe at the post office made really clear that having a live sense of how your own peers feel about things is actually really important. It's not just about, I find that really annoying as well, and little gripes and kind of being a naysayer. It's about really important shared awareness piece. So that's one thing that I forgot to mention. But yeah, I mean, it's changed beyond recognition. Well-being is a whole nother piece.
Sorry, I just talked over you there. But let's come back. Hold the well-being thought for a minute. I want to come back to that. But I think what you're describing is really important, isn't it? Because it could be so the sense-making piece. And obviously, we talk about that a lot. This is partly where I think the mechanism. Again, forget the providers, forget the the intent, but the mechanism itself, as a sense-making tool, doesn't actually make sense. And I go back to that, if you think back to the podcast episode with Jeff Marlowe, where we're talking about becoming a learning organization and so thinking about this layering of sense making that happens in the front line or happens in the body of the organization, and decision making is all done at the top of the organization. If you think of it as the sort of, as he would describe it, as the sort of classic layered to a hierarchy. So sense making is happening at the front, decision making is happening at the top, and action taking is happening at the bottom as well. And I think this is absolutely part of that, isn't it? If you think that in isolation, I give my feedback around the subjects that the organization chooses or the survey provider chooses to ask questions about. If I give my feedback to the organization, what's happening then is I'm not doing any sense making, or I'm doing an isolated version of that. That's part of the issue as well, that it's a really missed opportunity to think if what we want to be doing is creating this sense of sense making, decision making, action taking happening in the body of the organization wherever that's possible, right? And having that happen faster and more naturally. So that's part of the problem, isn't it? That utilizing these tools to aid the business in understanding views, and the bit that I think is really fundamental to that, right? As you pointed out at the beginning, dialogue is the missing bit, right? Because when I have X view and I can share that with my colleagues in a way that means that they might challenge that view or express a different view, that I can also see that, then we end up in a slightly more aligned place. At least in theory we do, right?
Yeah, I think and that's another thing where our own experiences of listening have really revealed. It's something before Harkn that I didn't realise how powerful it could be, was co-regulation. And when we talk about leadership being able to identify what the real issues are, what the biggest issues are, that can be really powerful, because somebody will say, I think communication is really rubbish, and somebody else will say, are you getting all these forms of communication, newsletters, or did you go to this event the other day? And then they're like, oh, actually, maybe I'm not signed up to all the right things, or I'm not looking in the right places. And it actually takes some of the not responsibility off leadership, but it makes people more autonomous and able to solve problems, themselves. It creates a flatter hierarchy.
Yeah, exactly right. So let's come back to well-being, right? Because one of the things you said right at the beginning, and of course I rudely cut you off a minute ago, you had to talk about it. What are your thoughts on the well-being side of things?
So I think whereas in other areas like engagement and culture and performance and productivity, surveys are fine but limited in their efficacy, I think with well-being it becomes like much starker because the risks are much higher. Nobody can sort of dispute that employee well-being is not in a very good place at the moment, and things like the pandemic really exacerbated that. Remote working's made that more complicated. But that's where speed is like so essential. And it goes without saying that in an annual or biannual survey, you would never be able to intervene effectively in a potential wellbeing crisis in time. And I think, and organisations that do pulse surveys and much more regular surveys, I think you could identify if you've got a problem on your hands. But because the surveys tend to be quite standalone, what processes do you then have in place to kind of do something meaningful about it in time? Because often people speak up in those formats because they have anonymity in place, but in order to pass them over to a mental health first aider or a HR professional, then you're going to have to take that away. So I think the shortcomings of surveys become very clear within the wellbeing landscape. But I know this is kind of your area of expertise amongst many.
Well, thank you. I think there's I think you're absolutely right. That piece. Again, it makes what we can use them for and what we can't really quite stark. If I want to understand how, as an organisation, people feel about the wellbeing provision, we have a provision. Tell me about how you feel about these different components, right? Or we can ask survey questions about different aspects of people's experience associated with different things. What you can't do, and I don't think there's a survey that can do this at all. What you can't do is understand movement in an individual, and I think this is where organisations are really missing a trick. That what we're all trying to do is anonymously get employee voice and insight about their experience of work, because nobody wants their people to get sick because of work or to be struggling because of a combination of factors in their lives, which the sort of human condition tends to allow for. We bring all of this stuff into work, and so that sort of, how do we take an understanding of what's going on in a group and what their feelings about certain things are, but then how do you pick out the voice in the thousand? How do I know at the time that it matters most who needs help? And I think this is a challenge, for organizations generally, and for the EAP providers and well-being support services. That insight about how life is evolving for an individual becomes crucial. And some of the examples that led to us building Harkn the way we have, and some of the tools that we've got, really emphasize that. In a space of 4 or 5 weeks, you can have somebody who is otherwise perfectly healthy and normal, if you put that, in an unremarkable way at work, and engaged and participative and the like, and then 4 or 5 weeks later be in crisis. We've got cases where we can see that you wouldn't know that otherwise. There's no clues given off by the individual. They're not approaching support, and in that decline, what you end up with is it's only at the end of the decline that the hand goes up to reach for help or to seek support, knowing, and I always say this, but knowing that that individual is prepared for some consequences, that ability to tune in differently. So that's that bit about how sort of crisis of any nature might emerge in any one of us, you just can't see.
Yeah.
So
I think with surveys, what always comes to my mind is like there's data and there's data. Like all data is not equal in terms of anyone can kind of collect data points and plot something on a graph, but the real power of data is what you're then empowered to do with it. You wrote an article maybe a month ago on, it's called Transition from Static Data Points to Dynamic and Human-Centric Insights, if I remember. And that captures that point really well, that it's not just, we talk a lot about taking a data-driven approach to well-being, but there is very much data and what you see in the data and the people behind it is where the real like potential for change comes from.
Yeah. Spot on. Let's talk about managers for a minute, right? Because I go back to origins of Harkn and the idea of where we were coming from and some of the early barriers. Of course, this whole idea of giving managers insights and helping them make positive changes. Did you come across much about that?
A little bit. I think, again, from personal experience, like I've been sat in rooms with like my manager and then the team, and they are asked by the organisation to kind of disseminate the results of the engagement survey and talk about kind of the high level themes. And I just always, my impression was always, gosh, my manager just looks exhausted and kind of sad about the things that are in the results, but also not, because it's, the engagement survey will always be like organizational level, even if they can then split it down into this team answered this way, which does somewhat compromise a bit of how safe you feel. I've definitely seen my own quotes from an engagement survey up on a PowerPoint presentation. But I think survey format doesn't empower managers to make changes based on their specific context, or to understand on a deeper level how people in their team feel. And again, it's like the feedback loop, because you might have had like a restructuring a month before you did an engagement survey, and now you're talking about it 3 months later. And in a restructured process, so much can change in that time that I think is dubious how accurate a pulse you have on how your people feel. I think a lot of managers, there's a lot of data at the moment on that's sort of pulling out a lack of training in managers and a lack of skills and confidence is a big contributor to employee well-being decline. But I think managers have a tough time because they're so constrained by the system that they operate in. To be able to meaningfully support their people.
Yeah, interesting. You just touched on something that sparked a thought as well. I remember years ago, we never worked with this organisation, but I remember sort of pitching the idea of when we were sort of still a beta product to McDonald's, and they did 2 surveys a year, and one was in March and one was in October, and they'd have a 25% variation in the result year on year. And I forget which order it was in, but it was the month that they paid bonuses in generated a 25% higher engagement level than the one they didn't. And because we correlate, when we use the sort of survey features in Harkn, we would correlate the mood somebody's in at the time they respond to a question, and the same phenomena is evident. I think everybody kind of knows this as well, right? That the mood you're in when you answer a question determines how you feel about something. So, and that can be as simple as if you ask us, if you do your survey on a sunny day, right, then you like leadership a bit more than you do when it's raining. And that,
Yeah.
so that,
I think even,
go on.
I was just going to say that not even mood, but like I've gone into Harkn and changed my rating within a day because like you might wake up in a really bad mood. And then like your work life is made up of many, many small moments. So suddenly like you're like, oh, I've made a really good breakthrough. Or I just had a really good team meeting and I actually don't feel like that anymore. That's why we give people the power to do that. And I think it's well worthwhile. And then if you compare that to the kind of how you might have felt on a day 6 months ago, it's like, certainly from my perspective, it's like I just wouldn't even be able to guess. So, you know, so much changes in working life. I think that's just the reality.
Yeah. So let's move forward a bit. I feel like we talked a lot about the shortcomings. What would you use surveys for?
I think the place that surveys are best placed to have meaningful impact is if you, I mean, okay, so the way that we use surveys, and that's not just to plug us, but I think is obviously very different from the way that all like companies I've worked for in the past uses surveys. And it's to supplement a kind of broader listening strategy. I also think it's about being really clear about what you want to measure, as with any piece of like research, kind of, as with any research survey, even outside of kind of organizations. So the types of ones that I would answer on Harkn, in addition to like daily check-ins, would be, you know, the sort of theme for the day would be how meaningful I find my work. And I find that like focus really useful. And then to look at how everybody answered on that in a pulse style format would give you valuable insights, I think. Valuable to an extent because you need the formats that give you like much more nuanced insights. I think you also, it's free form dialogue, isn't it? Is where the real like power in listening comes from, because the survey is by nature tick this box, which
I think that's right. You know, I think you look at the feature development for us has been driven by that need, hasn't it? You know, that from pulse surveys that were really about saying that we can also do the stuff that you like doing. You know, now thinking about the listening agenda in a broader sense and saying what is it that I need to understand. And so I think, focused dialogue, through prompts on the wall, team rooms. These are the anonymous focus group sort of idea. So you're having dialogue about a subject, and surveys in that list of tools you might follow for thematic subjects. So I want to know from a certain population of people, or I want to know from my team something. As actually one of our clients right now has some contextual stuff going on in some parts of their business that makes it really interesting for them to understand the impact of some of the things they're experiencing. So there's 4 or 5 ways that you can use. You can use sort of different listening techniques to draw that out. But the survey then in that instance becomes quite a focused moment in time, because it is actually in this moment I want to understand it. That's where I see still real value. But I also think that, in fact, before I say what I think, so do you imagine, are you seeing, based upon the research you've done, take aside what HBR has said, are there any signs of surveys going away?
I think awareness is growing of the need for I don't know what the right word, a more dynamic approach. There's definitely like rumblings, but what I think is important is that we don't move towards what happens with so many elements of like workplace culture and kind of LinkedIn debate of like surveys are cancelled. Like surveys are either good or bad. Like things are either black and white. They're either the right approach or they're not the right approach. Whereas should you stop using them completely? No, probably not, because they play a role. But I think where we've really gone slightly off course is I started off by talking about surveys in the 1920s, and they have changed, but they haven't changed that much, given that it's been 100 years, while the way we work and work itself has changed beyond recognition. So I think it's just closing that gap and realizing that whether your kind of people goals and business goals are taking a much closer look at what role is your survey contributing to that. And that's good business sense as well, as so much investment in surveys and just considering what might be a different way of doing it, what might be a better way of doing it, and catering to the workplace in its current form rather than, I think the HBR articles, old habits, and it is a bit of that because it's so ingrained that it's just hard to sort of evolve it. But I think it is evolve rather than bin.
Yeah, well, spot on. I remember years ago talking to chief people officer in a large financial services firm, and again, we didn't end up working with them. But his take was that we would, because again, we were much earlier in our evolution. We were a bit sort of one-dimensional, if you like, with our approach at the time, and but he kind of acknowledged all the stuff that we were talking about. So there's this issue with surveys, but he sort of concluded by saying they're a very difficult drug to wean yourself off. And I quite like that expression. It is, as you're saying, as old habits. It just, the process that we're in is difficult because you've got historic data. So it's sort of picking up the mantle in the way that we talk about it today. That if we want to be listening to people, I think you could say without a shadow of a doubt, in almost all workplaces, people come to work now expect to be part of the dialogue, to be involved in, have their considerations taken into account in the way the business is run and the direction that it takes, about the priorities that we're applying our energies towards. And a line in the sand once a quarter, once every 6 months, or worse. The worst I've seen is once every 5 years, by the way. That's quite an extreme gap.
No. Surely, gosh, wow. Yeah, I think part of it to kind of wrap up is, as well as awareness of the shortcomings of surveys, equally important is the awareness of your other options. And I think part of the problem for so long has been, we're really going to fork out all this money on another engagement survey that we're not really sure what we're trying to achieve with. And it's like, well, probably yes, because how else are we going to gather insights from everybody inside our organization? So that's part of the challenge that we have, is making people aware of the options that they have and different way it can be done differently and actually can be done better. Yeah.
So let's talk about the future then. So I don't think we've talked about this, you and I, in the context of this conversation, but we talked a little bit about what's sort of the shortcomings right now. Obviously, I've just talked about the listening organisation and what that might mean. What should the future be? What should people be doing instead?
I think in order to make a real difference to growing kind of cries for better employee well-being, better productivity, better motivation, organisations will feel increasingly compelled to shorten the feedback loops. I hope that awareness will grow of live employee voice, and fears around kind of what happens when you hear from people all the time kind of fade out, because that is definitely the route to more meaningful employee listening strategy, is always on and always live dialogue. I think surveys will continue to play some role. I think any robust listening strategy has multiple levers, because that's the best way of including everybody, meeting people where they are, and their sort of preference on how they want to express themselves. But there's certainly things that we see as non-negotiable for the most powerful feedback being, total inclusivity through anonymity and psychological safety. Awareness on all of these points is definitely growing. So I think we're going in the right direction, but we will see.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's you're describing all the right things, and you did that without being a shameless plug for us as well. So well done. There was a point, isn't there, about that when you the fear associated with changing. I think there are two big overarching fears with making a transition from structured feedback in survey form periodically, no matter what, of course, the industry has got faster. So technology has come along, and the answer is largely let's do faster surveys. But one fear is we can't keep up with the changes we're supposed to make from an annual one, and now I've got quarterly, and but I think that's again tied up in that cycle you described earlier on. There's an implicit promise that we're going to solve the stuff that, because we've asked you about it, we'll do something with those results. There's a whole load of stuff wrapped up in that we could probably do a whole episode on. So that's one thing, and of course the idea then that you introduce live and continuous voices, that puts that notion on steroids, right? So suddenly, so hang on, so you're telling me I could hear all the time what people feel, and then we've got to fix everything. And I think there's a mindset shift to accompany that piece, which is that you get away from the idea of trying to do you said we did into a more mature sense of listening and response at a sort of strategic level, so we understand what we want of people, the space that we need to create for them to sense make and make decisions that are appropriate for them and take action, but also understanding that not all bits of feedback and narrative from employees and their experiences when they're shared require a change project. They can require acknowledgement, and that can be as simple as that. The second big fear, which is the thing that prompted this thought, is that, and I still encounter this. We still encounter this, every time we speak to a new company, which is when we do a survey, it's just a dumping ground for all of the issues. And when we do those things, we turn on employee voice in the way you're describing it. So live and continuous. Aren't we just going to get that every day? And of course, the reality is not. Maybe surprisingly, but I think it doesn't take a lot of thinking about when you go through the processing wave. If I get one go a year, or every 6 months, I get to tell you what I think about X, Y, and Z, then I'm going to lump in on those things. I'm going to save up all the stuff I want to talk about. But I'm not going to every day complain about lack of communication. I'm not going to be saying every day that the parking situation is terrible. That they'll come up when they're important to you. And I think that changes the nature of the way we receive feedback and what becomes important, and of course, and also creates opportunity for problems to be solved as and when they're occurring, not as a list of 50 things that we've got to address. Which ones are we going to pick this time?
Yeah, I think we often come back to the relationship building piece because it is so important that if you give people the autonomy and the kind of assume a level of maturity, I think that they will surprise you in how they take that responsibility on. And probably the reason that a lot of surveys become like a dumping ground for negative feedback is because they had to wait 6 months. So you're thinking, God, I'm going to store that one up for the next engagement survey. It's actually much more efficient to hear that problem as it happens. And then people, if you can work to resolve it there and then, or if you can just acknowledge it, acknowledgement is such a powerful and underutilized kind of communication tool, then life moves on. But I also, as you were talking, I think the wrong way to look at a listening strategy is to only think of listening as feedback, because that is just not the only element that you need to like work on is belonging and connection, shared awareness. All those other things are so important, and they will help to make for healthier feedback models that are more productive and more, you know, built on respect and trust.
Yeah. Good. So is there anything that we have not covered today that you wanted to talk about related to surveys, past, present, or future?
I think we've given a good overview. That, as you say, there's always so much more that we could talk about. I think today we just wanted to. Everyone's using surveys in some way or another, so it's worth having a conversation about what they're achieving and where we're going with them. So I hope you found it useful, and we will mention a few blogs, mention a few other resources, so they will all be in bio, and our website has got all the blogs on as well.
Yeah, I was going to use stolen my thunder. I was about to say, as we wrap up, that we'll make sure that the link to your blog that inspired this conversation, we'll put in the show notes or the comments attached. However we do that, so I'm going to announce it without knowing how we're going to do it, but we can do that. And yeah, I think we have you know, any feedback, any observations on this stuff? Anybody who's watching this wants to share their views, their experiences, do let us know in the comments.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Until the next episode.
Thank you.
Please listen carefully.